What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Bookworm History, episode number 2. My name's Dan, and on the docket, as promised, this time we're going to be discussing 6 Months at the White House with Abraham Lincoln, the story of a picture, by Francis Bicknell Carpenter. Now, the picture in question is titled The First Reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was painted by the book's author, Francis Bicknell Carpenter. Now, we'll get into the picture itself in specifics in a little bit. In the meantime, I'll talk to you a little bit about Carpenter himself. Now, he was born in a small town in upstate New York called Homer in August 1st of 1830. Now, by 1855, he had moved from Homer to Syracuse to New York City, where he had a temporary studio, and then to Washington, D.C. And by 1855, where he set up another temporary studio, he had already painted life portraits of both Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce, so he had a reputation in D.C. circles as being something of a presidential painter. Now, growing up in New York, Carpenter himself was a staunch abolitionist, and to put it in his own words, felt that the Emancipation Proclamation, which had been signed on the 1st of January, 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln, an act unparalleled for moral grandeur in the history of mankind, signaling a long-prayed-for year of Jubilee. Now, Carpenter, naturally enough, wanted to undertake a visual tribute to such a great act, feeling that art should unite eloquence and poetry to celebrate such a scene. Now, Carpenter had a plan as to how he would go about doing this, and he called upon a wealthy friend named Frederick Lane to make the appropriate introductions, which included such men as Indiana Congressman Schuyler Colfax and Illinois Congressman Owen Lovejoy, who was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln's. Now, Lovejoy himself is the one who gets credit for making the introductions, and in February of 1864, Carpenter was given the okay to set up a studio inside the White House. Now, contrary to the book's title, 6 Months in the White House with Abraham Lincoln, Carpenter didn't actually move in. He was the closest thing to a painter in residence that the White House would see during the Lincoln administration, but Carpenter was only given the authorization to set up a painter's studio, which he did in the state dining room. The reason Carpenter didn't actually move in was because Robert Lincoln was due home at any time from school, and the White House didn't have enough bedrooms. Now, along with painting the picture, he also observed cabinet meetings. He was given, well, as free a rein to the White House as anyone could really have asked for in his position. He met with every member of Lincoln's cabinet, had them pose for sittings and for photographs, including Lincoln himself, whose photographs were commissioned by Matthew Brady. Some of the photographs that Brady took of Lincoln, especially those in the White House, are incredibly famous, especially because they're the only photographs that actually exist of Lincoln in the White House. Now, when Carpenter finished the painting in July of 1864, he showed it to Lincoln and every member of the cabinet first, before displaying it to the public. Now, Lincoln's opinion of the painting, at least in the words of Carpenter as taken from the book itself, were that Lincoln ordered it should go on public view in the East Room, telling Carpenter, "In my judgment, it is as good a piece of work as the subject will admit of, and I am right glad you have done it." Now, Carpenter's transition from presidential portraitist to best-selling author, because indeed at the time the book did become a bestseller, only occurred after the assassination of President Lincoln. About 2 weeks after Lincoln died, Carpenter would begin to publish a series of articles in various newspapers detailing his time spent with the president while painting the picture. The book itself was first published in 1866 and is still considered one of, if not the best source of information regarding the day-to-day operations and intimate goings-on of the White House during the Lincoln administration. Now, that being said, Carpenter was not an investigative writer, he was not a historian, he was not a journalist, he was a painter. So, as a historical work, the book certainly does have flaws. Many of the stories that Carpenter contains within the book, because it doesn't function as a full narrative. It's just essentially lots and lots of anecdotes and tales about Carpenter's time at the White House. And many of them weren't even stories that Carpenter had heard. A lot of them are second or third hand. Now, Carpenter does make a point to try and label his sources with every story that he didn't personally hear, but still it does go to speak as far as the value of the book itself as a historical work. Now, the book also does contain some of the most well-known anecdotes about the Lincoln administration. Just to give you one example, one of my favorites involves the signing itself of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, of course, that took place on January 1st, 1863. Carpenter didn't move into the White House until February of 1864, so he wasn't there for this. And again, he had it from another source. However, Carpenter's version of it is the only version that stems from contemporary times. and yet it's become one of the most well-known and retold anecdotes about Abraham Lincoln himself. Carpenter writes, "The roll containing the Emancipation Proclamation was taken to Mr. Lincoln at noon on the 1st day of January, 1863, by Secretary Seward and his son Frederick. As it lay unrolled before him, Mr. Lincoln took a pen, dipped it in ink, moved his hand to place for the signature, held it for a moment, and then removed his hand and dropped the pen. After a little hesitation, he again took up the pen and went through the same movement as before. Mr. Lincoln then turned to Mr. Seward and said, 'I have been shaking hands since 9 o'clock this morning, and my right arm is almost paralyzed. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. If my hand trembles when I sign the proclamation, all who examine the document hereafter will say he hesitated.' He then turned to the table, took up the pen again, and slowly, firmly wrote that Abraham Lincoln, with which the whole world is now familiar. He looked up, smiled, and said, 'That will do.'" Now, as for the painting itself, Carpenter took it on a nationwide tour to display it to the public, and had the idea initially to sell it to Congress. However, at the time, Congress wasn't very interested, and it wouldn't be acquired by Congress until 1878. In the meantime, Carpenter had continued to correct it, to adjust it, to tinker with it, and as a result, the current painting, which is hanging up in the Senate building today, has very little resemblance to the original, which came out in 1864. Now, I want to leave you today with just one more anecdote from the book itself, and it's one of my favorites just in terms of speaking to the character of the man that Abraham Lincoln was. "When he had thought profoundly, however, upon certain measures, and felt sure of his ground, criticism, either public or private, did not disturb him. Upon the appearance of what was known as the Wade and Davis Manifesto, subsequent to his renomination, an intimate friend and supporter, who was very indignant that such a document should have been put forth just previous to the presidential election, took occasion to animadvert very severely upon the course that prompted it. 'It is not worth fretting about,' said the President. 'It reminds me of an old acquaintance, who, having a son of a scientific turn, bought him a microscope. The boy went around experimenting with his glass upon everything that came in his way. One day, at the dinner table, his father took up a piece of cheese. 'Don't eat that, father,' said the boy, 'it's full of wrigglers.' 'My son,' replied the old gentleman, taking at the same time a huge bite, 'let 'em wriggle. I can stand it if they can.'" That concludes our discussion this time about 6 months at the White House with Abraham Lincoln. It is a book worth checking out. Again, it is one of the best sources for simple day-to-day inner workings of the White House during the Lincoln administration. Now, next time on Bookworm History, for episode number 3, we're going to take a little bit of a shift and we're going to talk about one of my favorite poems of all time, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I hope you'll join us then. Now, you can always follow us on Twitter at Bookworm History. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. Also, spread the word, share it with your friends. Hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.